Hello, welcome to Kirsten's book review. Today I want to talk about Marcia Reynolds' Coach the Person, Not the Problem, a guide to using reflective inquiry. In these book reviews, I will introduce the author of the book. I will walk you through the content of the book and then evaluate the books with the criteria of readability, academic rigor, and usability for coaches. My name is Kirsten Dierolf. I'm the owner and founder of Solutions Academy, and I am a social constructionist, solution focused narrative, and collaborative coach. I'm an MCC by the International Coaching Federation and also master practitioner by EMCC. Of course, everything we always say from a perspective. So I will look at Marcia's book from my perspective. I don't pretend to be objective. However, I do come from a very appreciative stance. I want to see what is useful about the book and where there are differences between Marcia's approach and possibly my own social constructionist approach, just in order to clarify where the positions are, not in a way to put her down or to evaluate her in a negative way. So what you can take from these book reviews is the content of the book, an evaluation of the philosophy, and you can gauge after, I hope you can gauge after this book review whether you want to engage and read the whole book or not. So let's jump right in. Let me introduce Marcia Reynolds, the author of the book. Marcia is a world-renowned coach. She was president of the International Coach Federation. She has been inducted into the Circle of Distinction of the International Coaching Federation, which is an honor bestowed upon very, very few. And she's written numerous books, I think 4 or 5, has appeared in most major news outlets, and is really an honored representative of the coaching profession with years and years of experience. Coach the Person, Not the Problem is a book that comes in, I would say, 3.5 parts. So the first part is about what is a coaching conversation, what makes coaching the person so powerful. And she also has a really interesting chapter on crazy coaching beliefs. Part 2 is about what she labels the 5 essential practices of coaching. And this is about coaching the person, not the problem, about reflective replaying of pivotal pieces of what the client has said, something she calls brain hacking, tending to the goal, and then coaching insights and commitments. Part 3 is about the mental habits of the brain, of the coach. So the 3 mental habits are aligning the brain, receiving, not just listening, and catching and releasing judgment. That chapter that I mentioned is her wrap up, where Marcia talks about coaching as a lifestyle and a culture rather than just as a practice. Also, very interesting chapter. In the first part, her definition, what is a coaching conversation? There are so many things that I agree with and that I find are not mentioned often enough. For Marcia and for me, coaching is about partnering. So coaches are not experts, they're not analysts, they partner with their clients. And she links coaching back to the psychology of Alfred Adler and gives a very interesting quote, which is, "We determine ourselves by the meanings we give to situations," which is a quote by Adler. Alfred Adler was a student of Sigmund Freud's, and Adler's psychology is often called individual psychology. And there are a few key principles. He says that human beings strive for significance and desire to overcome feelings of inferiority, which he deems to be a natural part of being human. Compensating feelings of inferiority for Adler are engines for growth. And we try to compensate for these feelings through personal development, achievement, and sometimes overcompensation. he also has this concept of lifestyle. So, in a sense, that it is not really about our experiences, but about the meanings and interpretations we give to them. Although his approach is called individual psychology, community and social interests are very central to his theory. He also is oriented holistically and is seeing people as whole unified being, and thoughts, feelings, and actions and body are always interconnected. Ada sees human beings' behavior as purposeful and future oriented. So you can already see that there is a lot of overlap with social constructionist views, even though Adler is a student of Sigmund Freud, and obviously there are a lot of remnants of Sigmund Freud's theories in his writings. But what I especially like is this idea of not being focused on the events, being focused on the meaning that human beings make, and seeing human beings as holistic. So, as unified beings, as interconnected beings. And I think that works very well together with solution focus or social constructionist theories, even though the foundations and the anthropology and the idea of what a human being is a little bit different. The other philosopher Marcia Reynolds mentions is John Dewey. I don't know if he's a philosopher or an education scientist. However, he refined the practice of reflective inquiry in his book, How We Think. And Dewey also is quite close to a social constructionist view in that he emphasizes the dynamic interaction between the individual and the environment, and sees human being as shaped by context. And reflection on that context and on that experience in the context leads to learning. And what Marcia picks up is that good thinking is not routine or habitual, it's reflective. And Dewey then argued for an educational system that would encourage and promote curiosity, inquiry, and critical analysis, especially of real life problems. And Marcia, and I think as I see that there is a strong connection between learning theory and coaching. So, how we think human beings learn has a great impact on how we coach. For Marcia Reynolds, reflective statements used by the coach offer clients the possibility to reflect on how they think. And this is also why, for Marcia, questions aren't really the core of conversations, but creating an environment in which clients are able to reflect on what they think, what they believe, and make the necessary changes. Even though Marcia Reynolds is an ex-president of the International Coaching Federation, she does mention critically that the focus of learning in ICF might have shifted away from the direct client relationship in ICF's effort to legitimize coaching. She says that there isn't one right way to coach, and I would agree that ICF is limiting what we are doing as coaches by the performance evaluation. And it's very refreshing to see these thoughts put out there by another renowned coach. So thank you, Marcia, for saying this. She also says, and please, everyone who's learning to coach, listen up. Coaching can only be learned by getting out there and coaching people. And she quotes Thomas Leonard, the founder of her coaching school, with that. In Marcia's view, coaching works because we need another person to challenge our thinking, to transform our thinking, because as we cannot tickle ourselves, we cannot transform our thinking on our own, as she says on page 20 of the book. Marcia justifies coaching's refrain from advice by mentioning that things that we hear only go into our short term memory. I'm not so sure whether this is actually a valid reason for not giving advice. The whole brain person language in her book seems to be a little bit confused, but I do think it is true that people, when they are given advice, do not activate their own solution finding or development capabilities and are more passive. And that's why self developed solutions are usually better than the ones that we receive from other people. Marcia argues for being very clear whether you are coaching and not coaching, and is quite adamant that we shouldn't mix advising and coaching. For her, steps to decide whether somebody should be coached or whether another format is more useful for this person is to see whether this person actually has a desire for coaching, whether coaching is the right option, and then also decide when not to coach. And one of her criteria that I find very useful is that as a coach, if you want to coach someone, you should believe that this person can figure out where they want to go and figure out what to do. And you, as a coach, also need to feel hopeful and curious. I completely agree that if you do not have hope for the client and if you do not have unconditional positive regard, these are my words, you probably shouldn't be coaching. I love her slightly provocatively titled second chapter called Crazy Coaching Beliefs. And the crazy beliefs that she mentions, and with all the crazy beliefs, she walks us through where the belief comes from, what is true and what is not true, and limiting. I wouldn't use the words true or not true, but I do think that looking at where beliefs are useful and where beliefs are not so useful is a good practice, and it's a fun read. So the crazy beliefs that she mentions is that it takes a long time to really be good at coaching, and I concur. We have seen people enter coaching fundamentals who've been really good coaches right off the bat without ever having coached before. Then the crazy belief number two is questions are needed to create a breakthrough or a new awareness. And as I said before, her whole thing is providing reflective statements, just like summarizing or sharing observations rather than only asking questions. And I completely agree because I come from a more conversational analysis background rather than from a psychological Adlerian background. But for me, if I was to describe it, when we're having a conversation, we're always asking questions, we're sharing reflections, we are using para and nonverbal signals. So we are co-creating the conversation together. And if the coach is only asking questions, the client may feel like the conversation is driven entirely by the coach, which is never a really good thing. Another of her crazy beliefs is also a pet peeve of mine, which is the coach must only ask open, not closed questions. If you want to partner with your client, you have to ask a closed question. So, would you like to do this? Is a closed question, but how can we get the client to decide if we don't ask a closed question? And the other is either or questions. And I think there is a good place in coaching for closed questions, as does Marcia. Another crazy belief, number four, is reflective statements are too confrontational. And I'm not so sure if I've heard this crazy belief before, but I certainly use reflective statements. We have this formulation of rescuing the spoken from the speaking of it. So really figuring out what is important to the client and feeding that back to the client in order to figure out whether we are talking about the most important bits, and then also in order to focus the conversation. Another statement close to my heart is coaching must always have a clear outcome or vision of a desired future. I've also written a blog about this, that sometimes clients really don't know where they want to go. And Steve DeShazer said, uh, you can know what better is without knowing what good is. So you can make progress in the desired direction without even being able to define the direction. And Marcia Reynolds agrees and says that the goal and the outcome of a coaching conversation should be clear, but it does often evolve during the session. Part two of the book is about the 5 essential practices of coaching. And she differentiates transactional versus transformational coaching. And what she means by that differentiation, if I understand her correctly, is transactional is what the ICF would call coaching the what. So have a problem, find a solution. And transformational answers the question, who do you have to be so that the problem doesn't occur? And the practices that Marcia Reynolds mentions that help us to invite the clients to a transformational conversation is focus, coaching the person, not the problem, active replay, playing back the pivotal pieces for review, brain hacking, finding the treasures in the box, goaltending, staying the course, new and next, coaching insights and commitment. That's a quote, direct quote from page 54 of the book. Coaching the person and not the problem, I have already mentioned. She says that it is really important to not stay transactional and just make a plan, but also ask the client what is important about this to the client and their lives. The active replay I have also mentioned, so playing back the pivotal pieces for review. We would call this, as I said, rescuing the spoken from the speaking of it. And there is a slight difference here in philosophies because what the language Marcia uses is quote unquote analytical. So she says sentences like, we act as a dynamic mirror where clients can more objectively view their behavioral motivations and limiting beliefs. That's on page 63. We would be talking in the way of being objective or wanting to figure out what's the obstacle or what's the limiting belief. We would probably be more interested in figuring out who this person wants to be rather than figuring out what gets in the way. Noticing emotional shifts is the next technique or the next point in her book. I did a book review on Marian Franklin's The Heart of Laser Focused Coaching. And Marcia has the same point here where she says people don't always tell the truth on page 78. And she softens it by saying that people are not intentionally not telling the truth, but that they sometimes don't know what they want to say. Marcia talks about noticing when clients have emotional shifts and seeing and sharing emotional shifts with clients using non-reactive empathy. And what she means by non-reactive empathy is that we are not feeling the exact same way the other person is feeling, but we are recognizing that something is maybe going on. I would say maybe going on. She would probably say that something is going on with a client. What Marcia Reynolds is calling brain hacking, and I find this language very curious and confusing, but when I read what she means by it, I can see that it is quite interesting. She talks about the middle of the brain, in parentheses, whatever that means, I really don't know. But she says on page 89, in the middle of my brain is a box full of stories I use to navigate each day of my life. And this is very much what we also do when we're coaching in a narrative or solution focused way by looking at the stories someone is telling and finding ways for them to be able to tell stories in ways that make them stronger. And Marcia also sees our stories as an opportunity for change. So if I've been telling myself one story for all of my life, I might develop a more strengthening, or maybe she would say a more accurate story. In this chapter, you can really see her Adlerian orientation, because all of or a lot of what she mentions around identity, reality, social needs, assumption biases, beliefs of clients fit very well into Adler's system as much as I know about it. So she talks about beliefs and assumptions and identifying beliefs that are not helpful, biases, integrating coaching the context and the social needs of people. So that's directly, I would say, from Adler and Dewey's thinking. Identifying life values is also something that is important for her. The one difference I see is that she positions the coach as someone who does the brain hacking, where we would be more strongly in the direction of collaborating and co-creating with the client. However, she is also talking about the necessity of resisting judging the beliefs that are shaping client stories on page 108. And I think there is a view of it is necessary to look at faulty beliefs. It is necessary to look at obstacles to what the client wants to achieve. It is necessary to shift from an incorrect view of the world to a more correct view of the world, maybe, which is language that we wouldn't be using. But overall, there is a lot that works in similar ways as we would see it in solution focus and narrative practices. For goal tending, Marcia speaks about the bookends of coaching. So the goal setting and the end of the coaching should somehow frame the coaching conversation. And in this chapter, she goes a lot into what happens at the beginning of the conversation and what happens at the end or throughout the conversations, and how we can track outcomes. And she has a lot of really interesting flow charts in there, and this is where she also focuses on we really need to discuss what is getting in the way to figure out what the person really wants. So on page 127, she has a flow chart saying, what does the client really want? What's getting in the way? So what you really want, what's getting in that way? So what you really, really want, what are you committing to do? So in finding out what the client really, really wants, and for her, it seems necessary to look at what's getting in the way and do that twice. Part three is on the three mental habits of coaches. Marcia differentiates psychological safety from trust and goes into what we need to create psychological safety. And she talks about us being able to create psychological safety by three mental habits, which are aligning our brain, receiving, not listening, and catching and releasing just judgment. Aligning our brain is, I would translate it for me as put yourself in a really good position to coach. So be in a quote unquote flow state. Don't be judging yourself while you're coaching. When you're coaching, be present. Have an intention of partnership, believe in the client's potential. And I've been saying that a lot too. So I was very happy to see that Marcia, being the coaching guru that she is, also agrees. Then the second, receiving, not listening, for her, again, is the importance of not just listening to the words, but really being present with the person and using reflective inquiry by playing back what you heard. What you hear is important for the client. Instead of listening to collect data, we quote unquote receive, that's on page 169, to connect with other people, to let them know we value them, strengthening the relationship, and to explore, learn, and grow together. Catching and releasing judgment. This chapter is exactly on what she says. And what I also appreciate very much is that she says, in order to release judgment, we must accept that we do have our judgments. It's just a matter of feeling when we're being judgmental and being able to suspend that judgment in the moment. On page 181, she talks about releasing I from our conversations. And I don't know, it is something that is for me, a little bit of a coaching myth that we can't say I in the conversation. For me, the coaching conversation needs to center the client and not the coach. And if you hear yourself saying I 10 millions of times, you're probably not centering your client. So I agree and I don't agree. I mean, it's not about saying I, it's about who's in the center for me. In her wrap up, Beyond the Conversation, the bonus chapter, Marcia Reynolds talks about coaching as a lifestyle and a culture. And being a coach just is not just something that, in her view, you do in the conversation, but it also has ramifications to who you are as a human being. On page 190, she says, when you are being a coach, people feel seen, heard, and values. Acknowledge your impact so it becomes part of your identity. And I think that a lot of us have had that experience that when you are able to quote unquote be a coach, also your identity and the way that you are dealing with other human beings outside coaching shifts just because you know how to be a more useful partner to the people around you. So this is what my take on Marcia Reynolds, Coach the Person, Not the Problem, a guide to using reflective inquiry. And as always, my 5-point ratings. First rating is readability. Coach the Person, Not the Problem is a highly readable book. It contains many case studies. It is very clearly structured. It is an easy read. It Yeah, maybe even for the beach, because it is so nicely structured. It has lots of tables and lists, and yeah, I would say the language is not difficult and something that you can pick up, read on a train or even on the beach. So readability, I would say 5 points. Great book. Academic rigor. I'm leaning toward 3.5, 4 points. So why not five? I think all of this, from my perspective, this brain language is a bit confused. I don't think we have a middle brain or, this I don't think that holds scientifically. I'm happy to be corrected. But other than that, from a philosophical perspective, Marcia Reynolds comes from a clear tradition, which is Adlerian philosophy of psychology, mixed with, I think, a commensurate pedagogy by John Dewey. So I would say if it weren't for the brain language, I would be able to give 5 points on this one. And then practicability, 5 points. But it's so cool. You have really crisp explanations, examples, uh, easy to read case studies where you can take what she says, immediately practice it. Something that every chapter contains something that you can try right away. I must say, when I started reading it, because there was a lot of hype around the book, and I tend to be a little bit of a contrarian, like, okay, do you really want to be reading this book? And I found myself really enjoying it. So, recommendation, a few caveats with regard to the different epistemologies between solution focus and Adler, but more in common than I thought. So, recommendation from me.